Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for coming tonight. I'm Mary LaCourciere. I am the Director of Education at the Nantucket Historical Association. And tonight we have quite an interesting lecture that we are sure you're going to enjoy. We have with us Eric Weberg, who's going to talk to us about the role of Nantucket in World War II and how Nantucket was a haven for rescued seamen who were sunk by German U-boats, and Nantucket's role in this whole in their survival. So Eric is a maritime historian and has quite a colorful career. In 1995, he became a yacht captain which was followed by a maritime law degree and then a master's in marine affairs. As the co-founder of Echo Yacht Delivery, Eric has sailed over 100 vessels globally. He's a Boston College graduate. He has studied geography at Oxford, law at Lisbon, and film in New York. He's the author of some 20 nonfiction books, which all focus on maritime casualties. He has commercially operated a tanker fleet from Singapore, sold shipping news, marketed tugs to Europeans, and briefly salvaged a tanker platform in the Bahamas. Though he is intrigued by Nantucket and his love for it, you can often find him on the Isle of Cuttyhunk, where he retreats to continue his writing. Eric, we thank you, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you everyone for joining us all around the world. I know some are in Europe and Asia, and so there's quite a lot of information I'm hoping that we can cover and share today. And before doing that, I just wanted to sort of cover the essential core, the essence of the story. And that is that in a couple weeks in May and early June 1942, just as World War II was first coming to American shores in the form of German submarines, 91 distressed Allied sailors, more than half of them of British and colonial descent, including West Africa, and more than a quarter of them of Chinese descent, Shanghai, Hong Kong, mainland China, washed ashore quite literally in lifeboats, on 5 lifeboats. And they came from 3 ships ostensibly, but actually from 4 ships, because it was like steps in a ladder to get to Nantucket. One crew experienced 5 U-boats between being sunk south and east of Bermuda to landing in Nantucket. This was so traumatic to some of the young mariners that they made no sense. Their intelligence was of no use to the Navy, because they were so confused and scared and conflating all these different U-boats. Some U-boats were friendly and offered them, food, wine, rum, and others were hostile and sank their ships, sometimes twice for the same people. So, but it's essential that we stick to those core facts. Those 91 persons, when they landed in Nantucket in a time of great stress, turned Nantucket into the leading landing zone for Allied survivors of U-boat attack for that short period. And then they were taken by one ship, the General Greene, to Newport. And what we're going to discuss today in a narrow context is what happened during those couple of weeks. But in order to understand that, we have to understand the larger context. And that is why were almost 100 men shipwrecked on one island in a couple of weeks? Why were there 40 ships, as you can see here, attacked just in New England, a 300-mile stretch, over 30 ships, one every 10 miles, as it were. And that's another aspect that we'll discuss at the end. But this chart shows you, and down on the lower right, you can see the Polyphemus. That's a Dutch passenger ship that was coming all the way from Singapore with some planters, a mixed bag of 77 persons, including 14 survivors of the Norland, which was sunk off Bermuda. And then you can see there's another one ship, the Madwin, which is sort of center of the image a little bit down, and that's a UK. You can see she was sunk on the 2nd of June. She's the star of one of our accounts, and she had 3, I say she, and if I use the gender-specific terms because all participants were male. So when I say he, it's actually historically accurate to say so, and it's not meant to be exclusionary. And also, it's traditional in maritime history, going back to Samuel Eliot Morison, to refer to vessels as she. If that's offensive, I apologize, but that's the phraseology that I'll use today. So the Madwin was a ship that was very important to this story because of these Ivy League survivors, 3 of them. And then there was another one, the Pysander. And so since the General Greene and her heroics are central to the story, I thought I would introduce the General Greene. She was a 125-foot, 38-meter long Coast Guard cutter, and she was built in Camden, New Jersey, near Gloucester, opposite Philadelphia. And there she is, WP 140. Had a fascinating history. She, right out of the blocks during the Depression and the Great and the Prohibition, right out of the blocks, she was raced up to Boston and did nonstop interdiction of rum runners and other whiskey smuggling vessels that bring booze from Canada, Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, which is part of France, which is off Newfoundland, Bahamas, everywhere. And so her job was to stop, she was a big ship, and to stop the motherships from reaching the smaller contact vessels. She did that very fastidiously until 1931, when she did ice patrol off Newfoundland. And then in 31, in December, the prohibition was repealed. And so she continued her duties up in Newfoundland in the winter, and then New England policed and other duties in the summer. Fascinatingly enough, the Panama Neutrality Zone kept the Germans from attacking not necessarily American ships, but American real estate in Canada all the way down. And I'm going to put my hand up here because the mouth from Halifax to Antigua in the middle was Bermuda. So to explain the larger picture, the United States did this Lend-Lease Act, and they traded basically leases on land that could turn into air bases in Bermuda and Antigua to protect that in the event that Germany attacked. And in exchange for it, they gave away a lot of their destroyers. So this gave the Coast Guard a tremendous amount of a disproportionate level of influence on the outcome of the naval battle on the Eastern Seaboard, which claimed 5,000 Allied sailors in US waters. That's twice those lost in Pearl Harbor, 30% more than 9/11. So the Coast Guard was fully manning 100% naval ships. And these Coast Guard cutters were having to do the work of naval ships, because with Pearl Harbor, of course, a lot of Navy ships were brought to the Pacific, and a lot of the other naval ships have been given to Britain. So we were not ready, frankly, for a 2-ocean war. So the vessel was twin screw, had General Motors, as you can see in this image, she had forward mounting mousetrap machinery, anti-submarine warfare, depth charge racks on the stern. But because they weren't used in what we're going to relate, it's not really germane. She did at one point think that she had a submarine in her targets off Nantucket Shoals. So Nantucket's in a way protected. It's an elbow sticking out in the Atlantic, and it was the turning point for both Germans and Allies as they would congregate. But before we leave this slide, she was off Newfoundland when she was asked to rescue the victims of U-boat attack on 2 ships. And she saved 39 men from the Marconi, which was sunk, Marconi being the inventor. Yeah, anyway, SO, the radio frequency. And after doing so, she happened upon the scene of the British attack on the Bismarck. They had just sunk the hood in her breakout voyage. And so this is an extraordinary moment that the General Greene stumbles upon this massive British sink the Bismarck, Churchill wrote. So next slide. So it's just an extraordinary event that this ship happened to witness, and once in a lifetime event. And of course, the hood and the Bismarck were sunk almost with an entire loss of life. What we have here is pictures of the type of survivor. They ranged from gentlemen that were from Sierra Leone, what was then the Gold Coast, Liberia, many countries in West Africa, to on the Madwin. And here on the same ship, these gentlemen were volunteers that were going to be ambulance drivers, everything from clerks to ambulance drivers. They were American Field Service, so they preferred not to fire weapons. and participate in other ways and contribute in other ways. The gentleman on the far right, I believe, is Westport, Connecticut. I was in touch with his grandson. You have famous names in American society. Ronald Gubelman, Liberty Madeira, when I was at St. George's, one of the dorms was named, for that family. So next slide. And they washed ashore. And what's fascinating about, and here's another, I think we've covered the General Greene for now, but her entire career, first of all, she was named after Washington's second in command, right-hand man, as it were, in the Revolutionary War. And he was at virtually every battle, as far as I could tell, of the Revolutionary War. So they say he's the most underappreciated general in the Revolutionary War, Nathaniel, A-E-L, Greene, with an E at the end. And 4 Coast Guard cutters were named for General Greene. And here's a good shot of the men prepping their weapons. Next slide. So today I walked the entire route that the survivors took. I'm in Nantucket, as you can see, and this is Brant Point Light Station and Brant Point Coast Guard Station, and this is where basically almost all of the action took place. So just a few words about this point. It's where the harbor meets the sea, as it were, on the kind of sheltered north shore of Nantucket, and which is the Nantucket Lightship was another, I think of it as a light to which the moths of both U-boats and Allied ships were attracted. And as a rule, 2 things would happen. Lifeboats would would wash ashore in Madwin or Surfside. They would be collected by Coast Guard auxiliary vessels, which were voluntarily handed over to the Coast Guard and manned in many cases by Nantucketers like Arthur Gibbs, Maurice Gibbs, Nantucketer's brother, who ran the Woods Hole Coast Guard Station until 1978. And then the auxiliary Coast Guard boats would tow the men and the lifeboats to Brant Point. There they would wait until the General Greene would collect more of them at anchor or in the fog and the shoals off Nantucket. And the Greene was ostensibly based in Newport, where they had a boom and a major naval base. And so it was a very fast, nimble, effective rescue craft. And at all times relevant, she was under the command of Lieutenant Shea, and you would accommodate upwards of 60 men roughly. And so you could cook there, you could have a medical also facility, doctors on board. Next. So here's a picture of the dancing lady at the fuel tanks, which I saw some today. And then there was also the Squam, the Alice A, and a number of other boats. It was not uncommon for patriotic Americans to hand over their boats for any kind of military use. Nantucket was essentially kind of a military station during the war, and a lot of non-essential personnel were taken off and or went to duty and service. They had active airfield, all kinds of military facilities. I had at least 4 Coast Guard stations that I know of. I'm going to mispronounce it, I'm sure, but Coscadet and also Sankaty and Nantucket, Surfside, and of course Brant Point. In one case, in these rescues, there were 4 airplanes utilized, 4 airplanes, which I think is pretty amazing. And one of them dropped a message, I presume kind of by bottle, but the pilots would just have a pen and paper and they would write it on their knee or their thigh and then open the airplane hatch and just drop it. And the Coast Guard read the message and called the Coast Guard nearby in Brant Point. And that's how the General Greene went out to rescue some of these ships. Next slide. So this is obviously too detailed to read, but this is a catalog of exactly. The head of the Coast Guard History Division was kind enough to share this with me, and this is available online as well in many cases. And it's a deck log showing exactly who was on board. So we can skip that, but it's good to know exactly. We combed this for Nantucketers, and there weren't many. But next, So this chart is. It gives you an idea. And lest we forget, on the bottom right is the Baron Semple. The Baron Semple, why is it? There's a mix in this chart of dead Germans from U-550, which, and also the Allied ships like Plow City. So these Allied ships were not did not land in Nantucket like Plow City or Baron Semple. And so you may ask very sensibly, why are they on this chart? And the answer is actually simple, and it's simple because it was actually really complex because let's just say I was a sailor on the Norland, a Norwegian ship. She was torpedoed by one sub, tossed into a lifeboat, rescued by the Polyphemus, which is coming from Singapore. That was subsequently torpedoed by another, submarine. And they were cast in with the lifeboats. And then they were accosted by a submarine while they're in the lifeboats, right? By another German sub who gave them, rum, and they kept the bottle as evidence. It was manufactured in Hamburg, and then so on. Blankets, cigarettes, directions. And each time the Allies would keep the bottles as evidence and report what kind of logos were on the bow of the German submarine. And the reason the Germans, so you had a higher chance if you were an Allied sailor of any nationality, and of those landed in Nantucket, probably only 5 or 10% were American. You had a higher chance of being rescued and tended to and taken care of by a German submarine, up to 5 of them in 1 week, than by the US Navy, because the US Navy just wasn't there at the time, not on the deep water. And so many of these men, found solace by being helped by the Germans, but were also somewhat distressed by the absence of help, as it were. And the reason the Germans were able to take the time to do frivolous things like share rum with survivors was because there was no air cover that was any menace and hardly any naval presence. So the German commanders felt comfortable being chivalrous. And this whole play, the Baron Semple, for example, offered the survivors a ride home. But the survivors said, no, we feel safer in a lifeboat going to Nantucket. And the American Field Service, who were privileged kids from prep schools and colleges and Ivy League, they went to Harvard, MIT, they were all over the country. And many of them knew how to sail, not by coincidence, perhaps. And so these captains, these hardened British and Norwegian and Dutch masters who had not maintained their connection with small boat sailing would defer to these young men who were experts at small boat handling and let them run the boat. And it was fascinating. And there was also fear of mutiny. You'd have 18 Chinese and 10 Europeans. And the Chinese were afraid that the Europeans were going to steal all the food. And so you had a lot of anxiety there. Plow City refused, you see her on the left, refused to stop for a lifeboat because they thought it was a German ploy. Well, they hightailed it to the dismay of those in the lifeboat, only to be sunk moments later. New Bedford fishermen rescued boats. The Torvanger rescued so many men coming out of New York that those being rescued refused to be rescued because there was no food, there were no beds. They had more survivors than they did, bunks. And the captain finally acquiesced and agreed with them. The last batch of Allied sailors said, "We're not going with you, mate. Just give us some food and we're out of here." And the captain of the Torvanger, well-respected Norwegian master, they had 1,000 ships at play in the war, and they answered almost no one. They had Nortra ships, was run by Avon Lawrence and Lower Manhattan. And they said, you're right, we're going to shore. Come with us. We're not going to Cape Town because we will be sunk. And she was eventually sunk. Next slide. This is New England in World War II. The exact number eludes me, but close to 50 U-boat patrols. 50 U-boat patrols. They were watching us. I've read the records. They know each yacht, how many stacks. One of them loved to hang out in Nauset, which was bombed by the Germans in World War I. Nantucket Lightship was a hunting ground for World War I German subs. They used to, before the declaration of war, they would replenish in Baltimore, and they ordered German subs in New London and ran over an American tug, killing 7 men, and got away with it. And they dined in Newport. I mean, there's a whole backstory to this. But this is New England under siege. They dropped terrorists in New England in, Maine, Frenchman's Bay, Maine, Hancock Point. They dropped terrorists in Amagansett, New York, and in New Brunswick. And women intercepted 2 of them, the sheriff's wife in New Hancock and a young lady in Amagansett. And they were both ignored because of their gender. Next slide. And so all the men, of course, made it into New York. And fortunately for the Americans, turned themselves in, most of them, and just spent their massive amounts of cash on wine, women, and song rather than destruction. The Canadian guy that was caught, he ran out of money and they sent him back to his wife as a punishment because he hadn't done anything wrong, really. This is the Pysander, and nothing exceptional there. Well, we can summarize the Pysander. This vessel had the largest number, 61 or so survivors that landed. Actually, I think it was 43. Anyway, in either event, not all the lifeboats landed in Nantucket, but this is the ship that had the officer Dandrith, which was the Dutch second officer or so, navigated the ships right to the Nantucket coast at night in the fog. And one of the boys was a Yorkshireman, and he said, "Hey, Cap, I hear cows." And sure enough, they were so close to Nantucket that they could hear cows. It may have also been the bellowing of the surf as it rolled in. But with great skill, they hung a pail behind the boat. These were very innovative sailors. They would, when an engine didn't work, they would use the Vaseline, which is intended to mitigate sores and sunburn. They would lubricate the engine until it started. They took with them small hand-cranked radios, and they constantly send out SOS. So the airplanes where others would pick them up. The very innovative mariners. So this is the ship where two of the lifeboats were found off Madwin and were towed to Nantucket, and then the mother, General Greene, towed them all to Newport. General Greene, Lieutenant Shea, had a unique thing whereby he would tie all these long lifeboats to the back of his, Coast Guard cutter and tow them to Newport, which is a pretty gutsy move. And it was this vessel which stayed the longest, 17 hours. They went on a route that I traced today to the Bennett Hall, I think it was Gordon Bennett Hall, which is adjacent and actually attached to a church. And I was able to sort of literally retrace their steps and sort of have a look under the church. And it's pretty impressive. The men were, it was a Sunday, and these things were adhered to. So they were allowed in to the church at the back. I think it was 23 Chinese or so. This is the ship. And so then they also saw an American football game, baseball. It was baseball. And I think that was on Cliff Street. What's interesting is they were kind of under escort. One forgets that there were about half a dozen Chinese survivors of the Titanic, and their lives were not made better, by being rescued because they were accused of all kinds of dastardly deeds and forcing other people out, which was totally untrue. And so there was a lot of suspicion from folks like the Chinese mariners or even the West African. Also, in fairness, without the Chinese, we wouldn't have won the war. They manned the small tankers, shuttle tankers from Maracaibo, Venezuela, going to Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, which would then refine the oil and then take it to Halifax via New England and then to England. So while we're on that topic, I'll just very briefly summarize. The Mercedes symbol or the peace symbol, there are three prongs at the bottom. So think of it, on the lower right prong is iron ore and bauxite. Iron ore is for making steel, it's raw products like mud, and very popular in Guyana, Suriname, Dutch Guyana, French Guyana. And then bauxite is very important it's essential for making aluminum, which aircraft are manufactured from, and so essential to the World War II effort. Then that's one prong. The middle prong is oil. That came from the US Gulf, specifically Port Arthur and Houston, and then wherever there are refineries, and then also Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao. The Germans planned to blow up the refineries, but didn't. A bunch of children ran out at night, and the Germans thought they were being counterattacked. They also didn't remove the lid from the muzzle, and as a result, it exploded and killed the German. So it was just luck. But the Chinese refused to work on those shuttle tankers. And if that had, the idea was it would take a few years to replace those tankers. If Britain had been forced to go a couple of years without oil, they would have been to their knees and been, a part of the Third Reich. It would have been a failure for the Allies. And so, and then third prong would be the Panama. And it was essential that these supplies, Panama had tons of, and Argentina, South America, fruit, salt, foodstuffs. I mean, just a whole array, nitrates from the whole Pacific. And that's really the only region that the U-boats didn't go, although they did go to New Zealand. So the point is that Nantucket was one of the last laps on the way to Halifax. Once they were in Halifax and they closed the air gap in May of '43, they destroyed more U-boats than they could, they were all retreated. Basically, it was the key link in the supply chain. Next. So here in the front are Chinese mariners, and in the back are survivors. This is a mix of Polyphemus, which had come from Singapore, and Norland, which was Norwegian. And somewhere in the photo is a young man named Cohen. There was another man named Grover. And these guys were like 16, 17 years old. When they took pictures of themselves in Brooklyn at Atlantic Street and Red Hook and Pier 6, they was like on a fire truck. Like they were 16, 17 years old. It's really kind of very moving. And like I said, many of them had survived several sinkings and were truly traumatized. These are huge office towers equivalent of steel. And they're your home and your bunks and your mates. And then suddenly they're just blown to pieces. 15 Chinese were blown, and the Chinese, of course, were kept separate, right? And so there were 15 of them died when the whole the whole section they were living in was blown off the ship by a torpedo. So very, very traumatic. And the Chinese, by the way, I should say, were really highly skilled mariners. But if you looked at the job descriptions of all, like say 20 Chinese on a ship, they could do it all. I mean, they could steer the ship, they could run the engines, they could run the pantries. There's really nothing they couldn't do. They just weren't given credit for it. Next. This is the Madwin. This is the Elder Dempster line. They're known for their trade in Africa. This is Kapstadt, Table Mountain, Cape Town. Madwin is named after a river in, I believe, Nigeria. You can see that tower in the front would have been used for observing U-boats. Everyone thinks that, U-boats had this complex, secret machinery for detecting, and that if Billy got drunk in the battery in Manhattan, they would lead to 3 ship sinkings. Utter hogwash. It was 4 scared teenagers with a pair of binoculars in all conditions on a rolling conning tower. And that was the only technology they had for detecting ships. And so the Allies' response was sit in the tower and the crow's nest and hope that they would see the enemy first, and the monkey deck above the bridge. And it was really very clumsy, and very few instances were the defensively equipped merchant gunners able to hit anything. And the Norland, whose survivors landed in Nantucket, was one of those examples where they actually did strike the Germans, who very smartly went 6 miles away and then bombed the ship very effectively. And the ship was firing at 1 mile or 2 mile range. They had no chance. Next. By the way, the Madwin we just saw, a gentleman from Sierra Leone was blown off the bow of the ship, and he was made deaf, and his cheekbone was broken, and his throat, I think, and he was in very bad shape. But they managed, to find him, and he survived. And I'll never forget, one of the officers, the American officers. Navy was their technique is to interview everyone and then make a report. But the British let the officer in charge write their own report. And the officer in charge charged that this man who was blown off the bow and couldn't speak because his face was mangled, that didn't work hard enough. And I just thought that was an extremely callous thing to say, particularly given that their pay stopped and that, they still had to obey orders. So next. Next, there's a sweet story about Cohen when they were in Brooklyn. A gentleman from Brooklyn took empathy and sympathy on these young men. They would stay in boarding houses, and they were all given what was actually a pretty good sum of money for their work, especially if you're a 16-year-old deck boy. And so the gentleman looking after Cohen kept the money until he left. And made sure that he could go home without having spent, all the money. So he sort of acted as a stand-in parent. Now, this is an interesting photo. This is Lorient in France, and it's Ernst August Reywinkel, the person with the white hat. Now, if you're into this kind of thing, which I am, you'll see a number of men with peaked black hats. They are almost certainly the Sparstrecker, the minesweeping convoy officers from land who are coming out to get a feel for the success of the patrol. Although actually the lack of facial hair indicates that they may be leaving. But on the right is you'll see a bull, right? The bull, and that is the bull of Scapa Flow, and that means that this officer Reywinkel on, I think it's 583, participated in the attack on Scapa Flow, which was a famous redoubt of the British fleet. And they penetrated it by wedging between two wrecks and then casually went at night and sank a couple of them. I think the Oak, the Royal Oak, and at great loss of life and embarrassment to British morale. And so if you were part of that small team of 50 or so men that achieved that feat, you had the honor of putting it on your bow. But for example, Uboat Schnee, he would put a snowflake, because Schnee means snow. And then this is only relevant because we're trying to figure out, well, which sub aided which Nantucket survivor, right? And so if they reported a snorting bull, well, okay, it's probably Rehwinkle, or, you could tell who was there. We now have every German patrol every day, every hour. His boat, Rehwinkle, the entire crew was lost without explanation on the next 2 patrols later, leaving Lorient, France. They call that eternal patrol. But so we'll go to the next slide. Now, this is an interesting photo, and I think of it really as tragic. And I've got, this is U-550. She has just sunk the Pennsylvania, which is a tanker. Then she hid under it, and the tanker was brand new and huge and going to England, very important. It was the south of Nantucket, only about 30, 40 miles. And the escorts wanted to find this sub and destroy it. They did succeed in doing so, but in doing so, they also set fire to the tanker, which made it unsalvageable. So here are all 44, the entire crew of U-550 made it alive out of the sub onto the deck, and they used their inflatable and so on. And it is quite an extraordinary story of bravery on everyone's part, but the American came bashing alongside the conning tower and rescued about 14 Germans, one of whom died, and said to his colleagues, because he had no authority to take this brash act before the sub sank, he was trying to whatever, and he said, if they start shooting me, just shoot us all, which I thought was an extremely brave thing to do. But then a less noble thing happened. After getting the 14 people, and the General Greene was on site, everyone left. They went to Europe, and all these 44 guys died. Slow, weeks-long deaths of starvation and exposure. And the bodies kept popping up, and a Harvard-educated patrol boat captain said it was a malodorous cadaver, a Canadian vessel, the Bernadou found them. And they're buried all through New England, Long Island, and so on. I would wrap up now with the following. The General Greene did succeed in delivering all 91 survivors to Newport. Several of them were taken to the next slide, were taken to the Brighton Marine Hospital. And one of them was Leonard Woyle, age 37, was kept here for very bad teeth. And this is what we're going to close on. The captain, the British captain, Shaw, was there. So his understatement, if I may read this briefly as a closing remark, with my false teeth, my gums are so tender. Basically, he gives the biscuit to his dog in England, who refuses to eat it and buries it. And he says that he couldn't masticate these horrible biscuits, and that it was tasted like Stockholm tar and sawdust. And he found his throat contracted and couldn't swallow it. So there ends the Merchant Marine, and what happened to the General Greene. What an end she had, my goodness. In ignominy, she served first in Gloucester, there she is, in March 4th, 1960. She was salvaging a tug off the entrance to the Cape Cod Canal, and in 40-foot seas and hurricane force wind, very bravely, and was washed ashore herself. Probably in those cases, a lot of the time you get wires and the props and stuff. The ship's disabled, water down the funnels, and she's washed aground and they pulled her off. Then she was sent to Newbury. She was decommissioned. She went to Gloucester, did fisheries, police, went to Newburyport, and she was there supposed to be museum piece. And it was a disaster, as often cases with these large vessels. So the Coast Guard brought her back and sold her out of the Coast Guard in 78, or somewhere around there, 77. And she was sold to Guatemalan interests who renamed her the Belmont. And she was sadly, a lot of them were sent to the Circle Line in New York, but she was captured carrying cocaine or marijuana drugs, interdicted by the Coast Guard, her sisters carrying this cargo. And we don't know her exact fate, whether she was razor blades or sunk for an artificial reef is my guess, the normal fate for such boats in Miami. And so it's quite a story. And I thank everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was fascinating. We do have a few questions. I think what's fascinating is how much activity the German U-boats had around New England and, the Northern Atlantic, was there any presence of US subs like combating any of these ships?
Well, no. They were basically escorted to Panama, Coco Solo, and out to the Pacific, where they did an exemplary job of destroying, Japanese tonnage, including ships with POWs. It's a different story. But no, and part of it, the Dorado was sunk by friendly fire. The French submarine Surcouf was sunk by friendly fire, rammed. And so, we did have a host of almost 20 Italian and French friendly subs that they had to be kept separate because they fought each other. So one would go to Portsmouth, the other would go to New London. But the short answer is no. The submarines against submarines were rare. And so there were a lot of coastal craft and patrol craft and smaller vessels. But it wasn't until later that the Americans sort of tooled up with the larger destroyers and so forth. But the most important thing is the German defensive tactic of retreating. They only attacked and sustained while it was profitable. And so they did so in January to May and June of 1942. And then with Operation Drumby, it's had about 7 waves, which is Hatteras to Boston. And then they moved south, Newland, there's the Caribbean. And eventually they captured the whaling fleet in the Antarctic, the Norwegian whaling fleet, Sumatra, Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, Red Sea. It's really where they didn't go.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, and what about all of these, all the ships that were sunk and they have all their lifeboats? A lot of these ships were quite a distance from Nantucket. How long was this trip to get from where they were sunk up to the island or up to Safe Harbor?
It depended on the skill. Quite often 3 boats would enter a storm knowingly and 1 would survive. But then the Germans would also find our boats and benefit from them, take the intelligence. They would find crew lists. They liked the pemmican, which is this high protein paste, the water and so forth. The lifeboats generally had red sails. And there's an amazing book by our Harvard professor about lifeboats. And his name is Stilgo, which is just a huge repository of lifeboat information. But it would take on average, many of them were sunk 400 or 500 miles offshore. So it would take 2 or 3 weeks to get here. And the sad thing is we'll never know for many of them. They may have been really close to shore and not made it. But there were hundreds of lifeboats. They became kind of a nuisance almost. Boilers would pop up from sunken ships, and the Coast Guard kept very, very detailed records of everything that washed up from foot patrol. So they'd have letters, very evocative stuff. Mattresses, and then they were patrolling the dunes all the time. So they would find officers in the company of someone to whom they were not married. And one refused to stop and was shot. So there's all kinds of interesting records.
So did any of the sailors actually stay on the island?
Good question. Yes, they spent 1 night. 43 of them were put up at Bennett Hall, and it was an emergency clinic already for the Red Cross. So Mr. Mooney, who's an attorney, his father was a policeman and his mother was a Red Cross volunteer. So people would bring goods as a volunteer to bring goods and blankets and so forth. But the one thing about the General Greene is its extreme efficiency at distributing and the logistical supply chain of getting them to Newport. They didn't want people to know that America was losing the ocean war on the Atlantic. So the faster they could muzzle these guys and get them back to sea, the better. So Warren from the American Field Service was sent to Newport to collect them, get them back to New York and get them on another ship. By the way, Lieutenant Shea, and I find this rather emotional, he checked into the hospital after the last batch of survivors, and they don't say why. And my experience, because U-boat commanders did this too when things went wrong, I think he needed a little mental time, to digest this intense activity. Mm-hmm. But they were deploying with the medical doctors, whatever the term.
Okay, and here's another question. I'm going to read. This is interesting. Did you have any help from German historians in the information in your research? And was the German effort focused on the U.S. Coast Guard, or was it more to the south, to the Atlantic, into the Bahamas?
That's a very good question. Yes, Germans helped. No, Germans are not at all interested in looking up family members from World War II. They just don't want to know. For us, we take it for granted, but it's pretty much verboten. Now, I've been to Germany, of course, and went to some museums and so forth, but most of it's archival, it's online. It would be wrong to assume that the German U-boats were after the Coast Guard or even the US Navy. They wanted one thing. It was a tonnage war. One of them famously said, "We are the biggest ship scrapping business in the world." It is purely sensible. It was logical. If you can sink enough tonnage before the United States and Weyerhaeuser and Kaiser and all those fellows who could build ships in a week, if you could sink enough ships before the Liberty ships came on, you would win. Because you would it's all about cutting the supply chain. And whether you cut it in Key West, and there were only 4 capes on the East Coast that were relevant. There was Key West, which is a shoulder year round, Cape Canaveral, which, believe it or not, was a big hunting ground. Ships were hitting each other. They would get torpedoed. A ship off Hobe Sound burned for 52 days. Then you had Cape Hatteras, that was pretty well known. And then you had Nantucket. And then from Nantucket, you get up to Cape Sable and Halifax, which is outside, in New England. So it's really amazing. Like Nantucket was one of 4 major choke points, as you will, for that. And also people fail to understand this. The Germans were not out to kill mariners. That's not their mission. Their mission was to destroy the ship. Any killing was accidental or ancillary to their core mission. And I'm not painting anyone as saints. No one was saints, but they didn't fire on. I think one ship was found guilty. One U-boat was found guilty of murdering people and helpless in the water. And the Americans and Japanese had open war where they openly murdered each other. It was flailing in the water. So that's why we never really pressed charges.
Yeah. And here is our last question. We've had a lot of interesting conversations tonight. It's this person is asking, were there any towers along the East Coast that are like in New Jersey to help spot the submarines?
Oh, there were many, and they were useless. A periscope is the size of my hand. That's a periscope. And if a wave is 2 feet and your periscope, you're not going to see anything. I did find an eyewitness in the Bahamas who was a kid and who saw a German submarine. But I went to St. George's and they had people manning the tower at St. George's. Teachers, their kids, their wives, their husbands were all manning the tower. And it wasn't through lack of effort, but it did tend to pollute the airwaves a bit because everyone's calling in. It'd be boring to spend 3 months looking at the ocean and never see something. So they used fishermen as observers and spotters to send a very ingenious system of sending pigeons back with messages. And I was in Nahant 2 days ago, and Nahant, Massachusetts, and they had some cables rigged, right? So they would bury the cable and lay them between Grays Light and Boston and Nahant. And that way, if anyone went over the cables, they could detect it. And in theory, you can actually, every propeller, each one of us, our face, our fingerprint is unique. Every propeller of every ship is unique and has a particular sound. And it's a pretty amazing science. Well, that didn't stop Joachim Berger in U-98 or whatever, June 10th, of laying, I think, upwards of 6 or 8 mines, right in the noses of this whole cable laying and huge, sub-spotting network. We threw everything we had at them. It wasn't enough until later in the war. And it essentially came down to the solution to the American problem was hunter-killer groups. For example, your ship, like the Nathaniel Greene, which had a 3,500 nautical mile range, would be sent to the middle of the Atlantic and not allowed to return to shore until somebody else replaced it. And your job would be to support aircraft carriers. And the weakness of the submarine was they always had to come up for air because the men lived under the water and they had to breathe, and the sub's engines had to breathe. So they just wait a few hours and you'll find the sub, right? And then you destroy it with an aircraft or a ship. So that was the solution. It was a brilliant solution.
Mm-hmm. Wow, fascinating. Well, Eric, we thank you so much for joining us here. You're on the island in front of our lifeboat there, as well. It's actually not a lifeboat, it's a whaleboat. But thank you so much for coming. It's been a fascinating conversation and really interesting to hear all these facts. So thank you for all your research, your writing, and for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We also like to thank all our members for joining us tonight. NHA members have been a big support. And that's why we can offer you guys programs like this. If you would like to become a member, you can just go to nha.org and all the information is right there. We would also like to thank our supporters, our sponsors, Novation Media, for all of their assistance and their help in producing these programs. So thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for taking part of your evening for us. And Eric, good night, and good night to all of our viewers.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.